think there's a lot of positivity in terms of moving into a story that the world is animated in all levels, in all scales. It takes many different forms. So a lot of people are talking about panpsychism. Even there are certainly a resurgence of animism in terms of a spiritual model. But I think that what's really important is to understand that the science and the spirituality are moving in the same direction, but the stories sometimes people think are mutually exclusive. So what do I mean by moving in the same direction? If you look at physics all the way down through particle physics, you will note that there's no inertial anything, right? So everything is fields moving or vibrating or exchanging particles, or mass is curving space. When you grow up in a Newtonian world, and again, so there's the facts of the science, and then there's the story that's put into it. And so most of us learn the facts of Newton, but what we take home with us is the story that an object needs a force to move it. So then we think, okay, there's things that move by themselves and things that don't move by themselves. And that's because Newton said, objects at rest stay at rest until force moves them, and objects in motion stay in motion until a force stops them. So why is this important? Because we grow up with a mental model, a very deep mental model, that there's two types of things, forces and objects. And forces move and objects are completely passive. This is deeply ingrained in us, so much so when we raise our arm, we ask ourselves, what made me raise my arm? It must be consciousness. That's the force, because this is an object. This is one of the malwares. There's no theoretical or absolute reason why reality has to be organized into forces and objects. Now, the first time I started thinking about animism was when I learned about electricity. And this was very confusing to me because I heard the teacher talk about the electrical force this, the magnetic force this. But when I would look at the illustrations in the book, that's not what was happening. This, again, go back to being very stubborn and naive. Because the illustration showed if you took a magnet and you coiled copper wire around it and you put a light bulb in the ground at the end, the light would light up. And they would say that's because the electricity. But I see a magnet, and I see copper wire, and I'm thinking, where'd the electricity come from? and they would just say, well, that's the electricity. They just use this term until I realized there is no third term, electricity. That's just a convenient way to talk about it. There's just magnets and copper wire, and when you put these two bodies in space, something happens. Who's moving those electrons? Not electricity doesn't move the electrons. That the electrons start moving is electricity, okay? So you see what I mean about mental models? This casual way of talking it tells children all over the world that there's inanimate things and there's forces that move it. And a lot of times they tell you are the inanimate child and I'm the force that moves you, right? So this gets co-opted at many different levels. Even Einstein said gravity doesn't make things fall. Bodies in space curve space, right? The planet itself is doing something. It's not like the force of gravity makes the thing fall. It's the mass itself, which is got causal properties, right? So you can start to see that there's something weird about. It's actually weird to talk about force and objects, even though it's conventional. And then I would also have these experiences, two experiences that stand out. One was I was watching Planet Earth, and it was narrated by David Attenborough. And it's beautiful. It's like National Geographic video or something. And there was this one scene, it was about the desert plains of Africa, the Serengeti. And it was like quick motion photography. So you saw like the hot, dry season turn into the warm, wet season. The clouds come in and the rain comes, and you have all these vernal pools where these temporary lakes come. And he was talking about the great migrations, like huge, and you see huge numbers of elephants and huge number of antelopes. And during the dry season, they're separate, but during the migrations, they all come to where the water is. And he was talking about the animals moving to the water, but the way the videography, the film was, it was like the water was sucking the animals in. And I'm like, well, who's moving who? Are the animals moving toward the water, or is the water pulling them? And it started to seem to me to be optional, because we think of water as object and animals as movers, and so we can only see the thing happening in one direction. Then I started to think, like, coffee moves 100 million people every morning, and then opium and the tea wars like have this kind of agency, and it's not trivial. And you start to see, you privilege one side of the relationship as active agent and the other one as inanimate. And I started to see this was a convention we had across all kinds of scales. Then one day, I used to have my horses at a historic farm, and to get there, I had to drive my truck up this big hill, and when I would downshift it, they'd have this, it would make this sound, and my horses knew the sound of it. So you come around, you downshift, and they come running up, And I was like, well, obviously the sound is calling them, And then one day I went over there, and they were out in the back pasture, green rolling hills, and the sun was coming through. Anyways, it was very beautiful, it was very surreal. And they were grazing, it was in the spring, and for the life of me, I couldn't tell if the horses were eating grass or whether the grass was growing horses. Like literally, that whole perception was lost. There was no difference. And so I started having all these breakthroughs about how we lock ourselves into one side of a multi-dimensional relationship, and started to see not a new agey revisit indigeneity cultural shift, but a shift in perception that became more and more real to me, and realizing that when you work both sides of the relationship as animated on both sides, I mean, this is very Whiteheadian, completely, 100 years ago, Whitehead said much of this, and no one's built on it since. But what happens is you're in a kind of dialogue, because you're noticing that the world is shaping you, that in a sense, you're animated by the agency of a lot of other things, and it's not you. And instead of getting all uptight about that, it tickles you because you belong in this really cool world. It affords you this relationship of belonging in the world that's so vibrant and so relational. If you talk about, reciprocal openings, the whole world is available for reciprocal openings. And then you find out something very, very interesting, and that is the whole world is falling in love with you all the time. The whole world is falling in relationship to everything else all the time. And you're lonely because you're putting effort and pushing away. And that's just the truth of it, that we're exhausted and lonely because despite the superabundance of opportunity to be in love and in relationship with things, including humans and non-humans and entities, we push them away. And so there's no gratitude, there's just habit. I just know from firsthand, rigorous thinking and firsthand experience phenomenologically, that that there's no reason to think of the world or any relationship as one side animated and one side de-animated. Now, this has a more theoretical implication because all our causal theories are based on de-animating part of the system. So in organizations, we have this term, we create our systems and the systems create us. Well, when we create our systems, we're de-animating the external world, and then we say, oh, and then the systems create us, well, then we de-animate ourselves. And so this is another malware. Like this one thing alone, if we could, the facts are still the facts, but if we change the narrative container or envelope that holds them, they bring forth a totally different world. Like you don't just get up and drink your coffee. You think of how animated it is, and that the way the tree grows and the cultures around coffee, and all this is part of the energy and the animation of the coffee, and the coffee itself and its effect on people and why they preserved it. And so I'm certainly not talking about any kind of retro indigenous animation. I'm talking about something that's real in the fabric of the universe at all scales, all the way up, all the way down. So that's what I really believe.